You know that moment when grief feels like it's crushing your chest, making it impossible to breathe? I thought that was the worst pain a 12-year-old could feel, standing beside my mother's casket on that cold February morning in 1963. I was wrong. What happened in the hours that followed would teach me that there are depths of human cruelty that even death cannot pause. Good morning, everyone. My name is Eleanor Thompson, but the folks here in Millbrook, Ohio, know me as Grandma Ellie from the Sunday Farmers Market. I'm the lady with the homemade apple butter and the quilts that tell stories. At 73 years old, I've lived through more than most people could imagine, and today, I'm going to share with you the darkest chapter of my life, the day I learned that monsters don't respect sacred moments. Before I begin, I want you to know that this story isn't easy to tell, and it certainly isn't easy to hear. But I'm sharing it because somewhere out there might be a child who needs to know they're not alone, that survival is possible, and that even the darkest nights eventually give way to dawn. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My childhood in Millbrook was what people would call picture perfect from the outside. We lived in a white colonial house on Elm Street, complete with a picket fence and rose bushes that my mother, Catherine, tended to every morning before breakfast. The house sat on a quiet street where children rode their bicycles until the streetlights came on, and neighbors borrowed cups of sugar from each other without thinking twice. My father, Robert Thompson, was the town's most respected insurance agent. He wore pressed suits every day, drove a spotless Buick, and never missed a Sunday service at Millbrook Methodist Church. People would tip their hats to him on Main Street, and the other fathers in the neighborhood looked up to him as a pillar of the community. He had this way of commanding respect wherever he went, a firm handshake, a booming laugh, and eyes that seemed to see right through you. But I knew a different Robert Thompson. Behind the closed doors of our pristine home, he was a man whose temper could explode without warning, whose hands were quick to strike, and whose words could cut deeper than any physical blow. The first time he hit me, I was 7 years old. I had accidentally knocked over a glass of milk at dinner, and the sound of it shattering on the kitchen floor was nothing compared to the sound of his palm across my face. "Clumsy little fool," he had said, his voice cold and measured. "Clean it up, every last drop." My mother had sat frozen at the table, her fork halfway to her mouth, eyes fixed on her plate as if she could disappear into the floral pattern of our good china. That became her signature response to his cruelty: strategic blindness, willful deafness, and a silence that spoke volumes about her fear. Catherine Thompson was a woman of contradictions. In public, she was vibrant and warm, the kind of mother other children wished they had. She volunteered at the school library, organized bake sales for the church, and had a laugh that could fill a room. She would braid my auburn hair every morning with gentle fingers, humming old folk songs that her own mother had sung to her. Those moments felt like being wrapped in sunlight, safe and loved. But when my father's darkness descended on our house, my mother would shrink into herself, becoming as small and invisible as possible. She never stood up to him, never protected me, never acknowledged what was happening even when the evidence was written across my body in bruises and tear-stained cheeks. The abuse wasn't constant, which somehow made it worse. There would be weeks where he seemed almost normal, where we could pretend we were a regular family. He would take us for ice cream on Saturdays, help me with my arithmetic homework, and tell jokes at the dinner table that would make my mother giggle like a schoolgirl. These glimpses of normalcy kept me hoping, kept me believing that maybe he would change, maybe the monster would stay locked away. But it always came back. His rage was like a storm system that you could sense building on the horizon long before the first drops of rain fell. The signs were subtle at first. The way he would grip his coffee cup a little too tightly at breakfast, the sharp edge that crept into his voice when he spoke to my mother, the way his jaw would clench when he read the newspaper. By the time I turned 10, I had learned to read these warning signs like a meteorologist tracking a hurricane. I knew when to make myself scarce, when to be extra careful not to spill or drop or speak out of turn. I became an expert at disappearing into the walls of our house, at making myself so small and quiet that sometimes I wondered if I existed at all. The worst incidents always happened when my mother wasn't home. She had started working part-time at the local library when I turned 11, and those afternoon hours when I was alone with him became a minefield of potential disasters. If I tracked mud on the clean floors, if I forgot to dust the living room, furniture, if I dared to turn on the television before finishing my homework, any of these infractions could trigger his wrath. But it wasn't just the physical abuse that broke me down piece by piece. It was the psychological warfare he waged against my very sense of self. He had this way of making me believe that I deserved every slap, every cruel word, every moment of terror. He would tell me that I was worthless, that no one could ever love a child as disappointing as me, that my mother only tolerated me out of obligation. "You're nothing but a burden," he would say after particularly brutal episodes. "Your mother and I would be so much happier without you constantly ruining everything." School became my sanctuary, the only place where I could breathe freely for a few precious hours each day. My teacher, Mrs. Rebecca Foster, was everything my mother should have been: protective, nurturing, and genuinely interested in my well-being. She had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a way of making even the most difficult math problems seem conquerable. I excelled academically, partly because I was naturally bright, but mostly because throwing myself into books and assignments was the only way I could escape the chaos of my home life. While other children played during recess, I would often be found in the library, losing myself in stories of brave heroes and happy endings that seemed impossible in my own world. Mrs. Foster began to notice things. The way I would flinch when someone raised their voice, how I always wore long sleeves even on the warmest days, the careful way I moved as if every step might trigger some unseen punishment. She started keeping an extra sandwich in her desk drawer, which she would casually offer during lunch, somehow knowing that I often went without breakfast on the mornings after my father's worst episodes. The other children at school saw me as quiet and studious, maybe a little odd, but generally harmless. I had a few friends, but I never invited them over to my house. The risk was too great, and I couldn't bear the thought of them witnessing the ugliness that lived behind our perfect facade. At home, my mother's health had begun to decline. It started with headaches that would keep her in bed for hours, then progressed to a persistent cough that she couldn't seem to shake. She lost weight gradually, so slowly that I didn't notice until her clothes began to hang loose on her diminishing frame. When she finally went to see Dr. Harrison in town, the news that came back would change everything about our already fractured family. Lung cancer. Stage 3. The words hung in our living room like a death sentence, which, in many ways, they were. My father received the news with his typical stoicism, nodding grimly as my mother wept into her handkerchief. I sat on the stairs, hidden from view but close enough to hear every devastating detail. The treatments began immediately. Trips to the hospital in Columbus twice a week, experimental medications that made her violently ill, and a gradual surrender. Of all the activities that had once brought her joy, she stopped working at the library, stopped tending her beloved roses, stopped humming those old folk songs while she braided my hair. As my mother grew weaker, my father's abuse intensified. It was as if her illness had removed the last restraint on his cruelty, the final witness to his monstrosity. The beatings became more frequent, more vicious, and accompanied by a new level of psychological torture. "Look what you're doing to your mother," he would hiss after striking me for some imagined infraction. "All this stress from dealing with you is making her sicker. You're killing her just as surely as that cancer is." The guilt was almost worse than the physical pain. In my 12-year-old mind, I began to believe that maybe he was right. Maybe I was somehow responsible for her illness. Maybe I was making everything worse just by existing. My mother's final weeks were a blur of hospice nurses, hushed conversations, and the smell of antiseptic that seemed to permeate every corner of our house. She slept most of the time, her breathing shallow and labored, occasionally waking to smile weakly at me or ask for a sip of water. On the night before she died, she called me to her bedside. Her hand, once so gentle and warm, felt like paper. In mine. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry I wasn't stronger. I should have protected you better." It was the first and only time she had ever acknowledged what was happening to me, and those words would haunt me for decades to come. She died that night in her sleep, and I woke up the next morning to find my father sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched coffee with dry eyes. The funeral was scheduled for the following Tuesday. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have possibly imagined, was that my father saw my mother's death not as a tragedy to be mourned, but as an opportunity. With the last witness to his abuse gone, with the community's sympathy focused on him, as the grieving widower, he would finally be free to unleash the full extent of his darkness upon me. The morning of my mother's funeral would become the day I learned that there are no limits to human cruelty, no depths too low for a monster to sink to, and no moment too sacred for evil to desecrate. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning of February 18th, 1963, dawned gray and bitter cold, as if the sky itself was mourning my mother's passing. I woke before sunrise, not because of any alarm, but because sleep had become impossible. The house felt different without her presence, emptier, colder, and somehow more dangerous. The protective buffer she had provided, however weak and inconsistent, was gone forever. I dressed carefully in the black dress that Mrs. Foster had helped me pick out from Henderson's department store downtown. It was the first funeral dress I'd ever owned, and its somber fabric felt heavy against my skin, like wearing grief itself. My hands trembled as I tried to braid my hair the way my mother used to do it, but without her gentle guidance, the strands kept slipping through my fingers, refusing to cooperate. Downstairs, my father was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table in his best black suit. He looked impeccable, as always. Every hair in place, tie perfectly knotted, shoes polished to a mirror shine. To anyone who might see him, he was the picture of a dignified man preparing to bury his beloved wife. But I knew better. I could see the cold calculation in his eyes, the way his fingers drummed against the table in a rhythm that spoke of barely contained anticipation rather than grief. "Eat something," he commanded, without looking up from his newspaper. "We can't. Have you fainting at the service? People will think I'm not taking proper care of you." The irony of his words wasn't lost on me, even at 12 years old. Here was a man who had spent years systematically destroying me, now concerned about appearances, at his wife's funeral. I forced down a piece of dry toast, though my stomach churned with anxiety and dread that had nothing to do with hunger. The funeral home had done a beautiful job with the service. Millbrook Methodist Church was filled with white lilies, my mother's favorite flowers, and soft organ music that seemed to float through the sanctuary like whispered prayers. Nearly half the town had come to pay their respects, a testament to how beloved Catherine Thompson had been in our small community. I sat in the front pew beside my father, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon us. The pastor, Reverend William Hayes, spoke eloquently about my mother's kindness, her volunteer work, her dedication to family and faith. People nodded and dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs, and I found myself wondering if any of them had ever suspected what really went on behind the closed doors of our perfect house. Mrs. Foster sat 3 rows behind us with her husband. I could feel her concerned gaze on the back of my head, and several times during the service, I had to resist the urge to turn around and run to her. She had become my lifeline over the past months, the only adult who seemed to truly see me and care about my well-being. During the eulogy, my father reached over and placed his hand on my shoulder in what appeared to be a comforting gesture. To the congregation, it looked like a loving father consoling his grieving daughter, but his fingers dug into my flesh with enough pressure to leave bruises, a silent reminder of his power over me and a preview of what was to come. The graveside service was mercifully brief. The February wind whipped through the cemetery, cutting through our coats and making everyone eager to retreat to the warmth of the church fellowship hall for the reception. As they lowered my mother's casket into the frozen ground, I felt the last vestiges of my childhood disappearing with it. Whatever protection her presence had provided, however inadequate, was now buried 6 feet under Ohio clay. Back at the church, the fellowship hall buzzed with the subdued conversation of mourners sharing memories and offering condolences. Tables groaned under the weight of casseroles, pies, and covered dishes that the church ladies had prepared, the traditional way small communities rallied around the grieving. My father played his role perfectly, accepting sympathy with dignified grace, sharing fond memories of my mother, and speaking gratefully about the community's support during our difficult time. He introduced me to people as my brave little girl, ruffling my hair affectionately for their benefit while his eyes promised consequences for any misstep on my part. Mrs. Foster approached us during a quiet moment, her face etched with genuine concern. "Eleanor, sweetheart, how are you holding up?" she asked, crouching down to my eye level. "She's being very strong," my father answered before I could speak. "Catherine would be proud of how well she's handling this difficult time." Mrs. Foster's eyes never left mine as she said, "Eleanor, you know you can always talk to me if you need anything. Anything at all." I wanted to scream, to throw myself into her arms and beg her to take me away from the nightmare that was about to unfold. Instead, I nodded politely and managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Foster. That means a lot." As the afternoon wore on, the crowd gradually thinned. Neighbors and church members offered final condolences before heading home to their own families and their own lives. By 5 o'clock, only a handful of close friends remained, helping to clean up the fellowship hall and pack away the leftover food. Mrs. Harper, one of my mother's closest friends, pulled my father aside near the kitchen. "Robert, I want you to know that Jim and I are more than happy to help with Eleanor. She could stay with us for a few days if you need some time to process everything." The offer was innocent, well-meaning, the natural response of caring friends wanting to help a newly widowed father and his orphaned daughter. But I saw something flicker in my father's eyes, a flash of possessive anger that he quickly masked with grateful humility. "That's very kind of you, Margaret, but Eleanor and I need to start learning how to be a family of two. We'll lean on each other and get through this together." Mrs. Harper smiled and patted his arm. "Of course, just know that the offer stands if you change your mind." As we prepared to leave the church, Reverend Hayes pulled my father aside for a private conversation near the altar. I couldn't hear their words, but I could see the pastor's earnest expression, the way he placed a comforting hand on my father's shoulder, the solemn nods they exchanged. No doubt they were discussing grief counseling, the challenges of single parenthood, the importance of faith during difficult times. If only they knew that the greatest danger to my well-being was standing right there in their sanctuary, dressed in his finest suit and accepting their sympathy with practiced ease. The drive home was silent, except for the rhythmic thump of the car's windshield wipers clearing away the light snow that had begun to fall. I stared out the passenger window at the familiar streets of Millbrook, wondering if I would ever see them the same way again. Everything looked different now, darker, more threatening, as if the very landscape had been infected by my growing dread. Our house on Elm Street looked exactly the same as we pulled into the driveway, but it felt like returning to a tomb. The Neighbors had left their porch lights on in a show of solidarity, and someone had shoveled our front walk clear of snow. These small kindnesses from our community should have been comforting, but instead they highlighted how alone we truly were behind our own front door. My father parked the car and sat for a moment with the engine running, staring at the house that was now our prison without any witnesses. In the dim light of the dashboard, his profile looked carved from stone, cold and unforgiving. "Well," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that made my blood run cold. "Here we are. Just the two of us now." He turned to look at me directly, and in his eyes I saw something that would haunt my nightmares for decades to come. It wasn't grief or loss or even anger. It was anticipation. The look of a predator who had been waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike, and now knew that moment had finally arrived. "Time to go inside, Eleanor. We have a lot to discuss." The snow continued to fall as we walked up the front steps, erasing our footprints and covering the world in a blanket of deceptive purity. Behind us, the church bells of Millbrook Methodist began their evening toll, marking the end of the day we had laid my mother to rest. What I didn't know was that we were also marking the beginning of the darkest chapter of my young life. The man walking beside me up those familiar steps was no longer content to hide his true nature during stolen moments when my mother was away. With her death, the last restraint on his cruelty had been removed, and the mask he wore for the outside world was about to slip away completely. As he turned the key in our front door, I caught a glimpse of our reflection in the glass. A grieving father and his vulnerable daughter, seeking comfort in each other during their time of loss. It was the last image of innocence I would see, for a very long time. The door closed behind us with a final, decisive click, sealing us both inside the house where my mother's absence hung like a heavy shroud over every room. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears and the soft whisper of snow against the windows. My father hung up his coat with deliberate care, smoothing away every wrinkle, arranging it perfectly on its hanger. Even in this, his obsessive need for control was evident. When he turned to face me, the transformation was already beginning. The sympathetic widower from the church was disappearing, replaced by something far more dangerous. "Take off your funeral dress," he said quietly. "We don't want to get it dirty." And in that moment, standing in our front hallway with my mother's funeral flowers still fresh in my memory, I realized that the nightmare I had been living was about to become something infinitely worse. The house felt different the moment we stepped inside. Without my mother's presence, every shadow seemed deeper, every creak of the old wooden floors more ominous. The familiar sense of her lavender perfume and the vanilla candles she loved had already begun to fade, replaced by something colder, more sterile. It was as if the house itself knew that its heart had been ripped away. I stood frozen in the hallway, still wearing my black funeral dress, watching my father with the careful attention of prey studying a predator. He moved through our home with a new sense of ownership, touching surfaces that had been my mother's domain, rearranging small items that she had carefully placed. It was subtle, but unmistakably territorial. A dog marking his expanded territory. I said, "Take off that dress, Eleanor." His voice carried a tone I had never heard before, something between command and threat that made my skin crawl. "You don't want to ruin it on the very day we honored your mother's memory, do you?" There was something about the way he emphasized honored that made me feel sick to my stomach. As if what we had just experienced at the church was some kind of performance he had orchestrated, rather than a genuine farewell to the woman we both supposedly loved. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom on trembling legs, each step feeling like I was ascending to my own execution. The photographs lining the stairwell seemed to watch me pass. Images of happier times, family vacations, birthday parties where my mother's smile looked genuine, and my father's arm around her shoulders seemed protective rather than possessive. In my room, I carefully hung up the funeral dress, my fingers lingering on the black fabric as if it were armor I was reluctant to remove. Through my window, I could see the warm glow of lights in the neighboring houses. Families gathered around dinner tables, children doing homework, parents helping with bedtime routines. Normal lives continuing while mine teetered on the edge of an abyss. I changed into my everyday clothes, a simple blue skirt and white blouse that my mother had bought me for school. As I buttoned the blouse, my hands shook so violently that I had to attempt it 3 times. The mirror on my dresser reflected a pale, frightened girl who looked far younger than her 12 years, and I had the strangest sensation that I was looking at someone else entirely. When I came back downstairs, my father was in the living room, sitting in my mother's favorite chair, something he had never done while she was alive. He had removed his suit jacket and loosened his tie, but his posture remained rigid, controlled. On the coffee table beside him sat a glass of whiskey, amber liquid catching the lamplight like liquid fire. "Come here, Eleanor," he said without looking at me. "Sit down. We need to discuss some new arrangements now that it's just the 2 of us." I perched on the edge of the sofa, as far from him as the furniture would allow. The room felt cavernous around us, filled with the deafening silence that had replaced my mother's gentle humming and quiet movements. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to tick more loudly than usual, marking time like a countdown to disaster. "Your mother is gone," he began, stating the obvious with clinical detachment. "That means things are going to change around here. You're going to have to grow up faster than we planned, take on more responsibilities. Do you understand?" I nodded mutely, not trusting my voice to remain steady. Something in his tone suggested that responsibilities meant something far more sinister than doing more chores or helping with cooking. He took a long sip of his whiskey before continuing. "You're all I have left of her, you know. The only piece of Catherine that remains in this world." His eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "That makes you very precious to me, Eleanor. Very special." The way he said, "special," made every instinct in my body scream danger. I had heard that tone before, in the moments before his worst episodes of violence, but this was different. This carried an undertone of something darker, more twisted than simple rage. "I think we should start with dinner," he said, standing abruptly. "Your mother always insisted we maintain proper meal times. We'll honor her memory by continuing her traditions." In the kitchen, he moved with surprising efficiency, pulling ingredients from the refrigerator and cupboards with the confidence of someone who had been observing meal preparation for years. As he worked, he kept up a steady stream of conversation that felt rehearsed, artificial. "You know, Eleanor, I've been thinking about your education. Perhaps it's time we considered alternatives to public school. Homeschooling might be more appropriate for a girl in your circumstances." The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. School was my sanctuary, my escape, the only place where Mrs. Foster's kind eyes could watch over me and ensure my safety for a few precious hours each day. The thought of being trapped in this house 24 hours a day, completely at his mercy, was more terrifying than anything I could imagine. "But Daddy," I managed to say, the word feeling foreign on my tongue, "I like school. My grades are good, and Mrs. Foster says—" "Mrs. Foster," he interrupted, his voice sharp as a blade, "is no longer your concern. I am your father, your guardian, your only family. What I say goes, and what I think is best for you is all that matters." He placed a plate in front of me. Meatloaf and mashed potatoes, one of my mother's simple, comforting meals. But the food might as well have been sawdust for all the appetite I had. My stomach churned with anxiety, and each bite felt like swallowing stones. "Eat," he commanded when he noticed me pushing food around my plate. "You need to keep your strength up. We have a long road ahead of us, you and I." The phrase sent chills down my spine. I forced myself to take a few bites, knowing that refusing would only escalate whatever was building between us. As I ate, he watched me with the focused attention of a scientist observing an experiment, noting every movement, every expression. "You look so much like her, you know," he said suddenly. "Especially around the eyes. Sometimes when you're not. Looking directly at me, I can almost pretend." He trailed off, but the implication hung in the air like poison gas. I kept my gaze fixed on my plate, afraid to meet his eyes, afraid of what I might see there. After dinner, he insisted that I help with the dishes, another new responsibility that felt more like a test than a chore. As we stood side by side at the kitchen sink, I was acutely aware of his proximity, the way he would brush against me unnecessarily when reaching for a dish towel, the way his breathing seemed heavier than usual. "Your mother and I," he said quietly. As we dried the last plate, "We had our problems. Marriage isn't always easy, Eleanor. Sometimes people need outlets for their frustrations." I didn't understand what he meant, but the way he said it made my blood run cold. There was something predatory in his voice, something that suggested I was about to learn exactly what those outlets were. When we finished in the kitchen, he suggested we spend some time together in the living room. Quality father-daughter. Time, he called it. But as we sat on the sofa, him with another whiskey and me with my hands folded tightly in my lap, I realized that everything about this felt wrong, unnatural, dangerous. "Come closer," he said, patting the cushion beside him. "Don't be shy. We're family." Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to flee upstairs to my room and lock the door. But I was 12 years old, completely dependent on this man for food, shelter, and survival. Where could I go? Who would believe me? And what would he do if I defied him? Reluctantly, I moved closer, the space between us shrinking to mere inches. He put his arm around me in what might have looked like a fatherly embrace to an outside observer, but his grip was too tight, too possessive, holding me in place rather than offering comfort. "That's better," he murmured, his breath hot against my ear. "We need to be close now, Eleanor. We need to take care of each other." His free hand began to move, tracing patterns on my arm that made my skin crawl. This wasn't the touch of a father comforting his grieving daughter. This was something else entirely, something that violated every boundary between parent and child. "Daddy." "I'm tired," I whispered, desperately hoping he would let me escape to my room. "Can I go to bed now?" "Not yet," he said, his grip tightening. "We're not finished with our talk. You see, Eleanor, now that your mother is gone, you're going to have to fill certain roles in this household." The words hit me like ice water. Even at 12, I understood the implication, the horrible suggestion he was making. My mother had been gone for less than 12 hours, and already he was preparing to defile her memory in the most unspeakable way possible. "I don't understand," I lied, hoping that feigning ignorance might somehow protect me from what was coming. "You will," he said with absolute certainty. "You're a smart girl, Eleanor. You'll learn quickly." His hand moved higher on my arm, fingers tracing the collar of my blouse with deliberate intent. The room seemed to spin around me, the familiar furniture and family photographs blurring into a nightmare landscape where nothing was safe, nothing was sacred. "Please," I whispered, the word barely audible. "I want to go to my room." "Soon," he promised, but his tone suggested that soon might be hours away, or never. "First, we need to establish some new rules for our household." And as he began to explain those rules, each one more horrifying than the last, I realized that the father I had known, however cruel and violent, was gone. In his place sat a monster who saw his wife's death not as a tragedy to mourn, but as an opportunity to claim something that had never been his to take. The grandfather clock chimed 9 o'clock, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the ordinary sounds of our neighborhood settling in for the night. But inside our house on Elm Street, normalcy had died along with my mother, and something unspeakable was being born in its place. The grandfather clock had just finished chiming 10 o'clock when my father's mask finally slipped completely away. What happened in the next hour would shatter every concept I had about safety, family, and the sanctity of grief. Even now, 60 years later, I struggle to find words for the depth of his depravity. How a man could use his wife's funeral as the backdrop for such unthinkable cruelty. "Eleanor," he said, his voice taking on that commanding tone that I had learned to fear. "I want you to go upstairs and bring down your mother's jewelry box, the wooden one from her dresser." The request seemed strange, but harmless enough. My mother's jewelry box was a beautiful mahogany piece that had belonged to her own mother, filled with simple pieces that held more sentimental value than monetary worth. Pearl earrings from her wedding day, a locket with my baby picture inside, the gold cross she wore to church every Sunday. I climbed the stairs on unsteady legs, grateful for any excuse to leave his presence, even temporarily. My parents' bedroom felt like a shrine now, everything exactly as my mother had left it. Her hairbrush still held strands of her graying auburn hair, and her reading glasses sat folded on the nightstand beside a half-finished novel she would never complete. The jewelry box sat on her vanity, its surface polished to a warm shine. As I lifted it, the familiar melody of Moon River began to play, the same song that had lullabied me to sleep countless times when I was small and frightened. The sound brought tears to my eyes, a reminder of gentler times when my mother's presence could still provide some measure of protection. When I returned to the living room, my father had refilled his whiskey glass and was studying family photographs on the mantelpiece with an expression I couldn't quite read. He turned when he heard my footsteps, and I noticed that his face was flushed, whether from alcohol or something else entirely. "Set it on the coffee table," he instructed. "Open it." I did as he asked, the tiny ballerina inside beginning her eternal dance as the melody tinkled through the silent room. The jewelry sparkled under the lamplight, modest pieces that had adorned my mother's neck and wrists for church services, anniversary dinners, and special occasions. "Pick up the pearl necklace," he said, his voice strangely thick. "The one she wore to our wedding." With trembling fingers, I lifted the delicate strand of pearls, small, lustrous beads that had caught the light as my mother walked down the aisle of Millbrook Methodist Church 25 years earlier. They felt warm in my hands, as if they still held some essence of her presence. "Do you know why I bought those for her?" he asked, moving closer to where I sat on the sofa. "Because pearls represent purity, innocence, everything a good wife should be." His words carried an undertone that made my stomach clench with dread. There was something ritualistic about this moment, as if he were conducting some kind of twisted ceremony over my mother's still warm grave. "Put them on," he commanded. "But Daddy, these are Mama's. Put them on." The words came out as a growl, brooking no argument. With shaking hands, I fastened the pearl necklace around my throat. The clasp was difficult to manage, and I fumbled with it for several long seconds while he watched with that same intense focus. When the pearls finally settled against my collarbone, they felt heavy as a chain, cold against my skin despite the warmth they had held moments before. "Beautiful," he whispered, but the word sounded obscene coming from his lips. "Just like she was at your age." He reached out and touched the pearls with one finger, tracing their curve around my neck. The contact sent waves of revulsion through my body, but I sat frozen, paralyzed by fear and the horrible realization of what was happening. "Your mother was pure when I married her," he continued, his voice taking on a dreamy, distant quality. "Innocent, untouched, just like you are now." The comparison he was drawing between me and my mother sent panic coursing through my veins. I tried to stand, to escape to my room, but his hand shot out and gripped my wrist with bruising force. "We're not finished yet?" he said, his eyes never leaving my face. "Sit back down." I obeyed, knowing that resistance would only make whatever was coming worse. He released my wrist but remained close enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the red veins that had appeared in the whites of his eyes. "Do you remember your mother's wedding dress?" he asked conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather rather than conducting this horrific violation of her memory. She looked like an angel in white satin and lace, so pure, so perfect. He paused to take another sip of whiskey, his gaze roaming over me in a way that made my skin crawl. "She's not here to wear it anymore, is she? But you're just about her size when she was young." The implication of his words hit me like a physical blow. He wanted me to wear my mother's wedding dress on the day of her funeral, while I couldn't even complete the thought. But my body understood what my mind refused to process, and I began to shake uncontrollably. "Please, Daddy," I whispered, the words barely audible. "I don't want to. It's not right." "Not right?" He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "I'll tell you what's not right, Eleanor. What's not right is a man being left alone with all these needs. What's not right is having to bury the only woman who understood her duties as a wife." His hand moved to my shoulder, fingers digging into the fabric of my blouse with possessive force. "But you're going to learn those duties, aren't you? You're going to take care of your daddy the way a good daughter should." The words were spoken with such casual certainty that it took several seconds for their full meaning to register. When it did, the room began to spin around me. This couldn't be happening. Not tonight. Not on the day we had laid my mother to rest. "I want you to go upstairs," he said, standing and pulling me to my feet with him. "Go to my bedroom, to the closet. You'll find your mother's wedding dress hanging in the back, behind the winter coats." "No," I said, the word escaping before I could stop it. "No, I won't. This is wrong. Mama wouldn't want—" The slap came so fast and hard that I didn't see it coming. My head snapped to the side and the taste of blood filled my mouth where my teeth cut into my inner cheek. But worse than the physical pain was the look in his eyes. A cold fury that promised much worse if I continued to defy him. "Your mama is dead," he snarled, his face inches from mine. "Dead, and buried and never coming back. I'm all you have now, and you'll do what I say when I say it. Do you understand me?" Through my tears and the ringing in my ears, I managed to nod. The pearls around my neck felt like they were choking me, a reminder of the sacred memories he was twisting into something unspeakable. "Good girl," he said, his voice returning to that false gentleness that was somehow more terrifying than his anger. "Now go upstairs and put on that dress. Make yourself beautiful for your daddy." I climbed the stairs on legs that felt like rubber, each step taking me closer to a violation so profound that my mind simply couldn't process it. In my parents' bedroom, I opened the closet door with trembling hands and pushed aside the winter coats until I found it. My mother's wedding dress, preserved in a clear garment bag like a museum piece. The dress was beautiful, just as he had described. Ivory satin with delicate lace sleeves and tiny pearl buttons that ran from the high neckline to the fitted waist. It had been carefully preserved, the fabric still pristine, despite being more than 2 decades old. My mother had shown it to me once when I was very young, telling me stories about her wedding day and how she had felt like a princess walking down the aisle. Now, the sight of it filled me with horror. How could something so beautiful, so sacred to my mother's memory, be transformed into an instrument of such cruelty? I heard his footsteps on the stairs and knew I had no choice. With hands that shook so violently I could barely manage the buttons, I changed into the dress. It fit almost perfectly. My mother had been small like me when she was young, and the measurements were eerily close to my own 12-year-old frame. When he appeared in the doorway, his reaction was immediate and disturbing. His eyes widened, and he drew in a sharp breath as if he had been punched. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at me with an expression that mixed wonder and hunger, and something that might have been grief. "Catherine," he whispered, and I realized with sick certainty that in his twisted mind, he was seeing my mother, not me. The dress, the pearls, the careful staging, it was all part of some deranged fantasy where he could reclaim what death had taken from him. "Please," I begged one last time, my voice barely a whisper. "Please don't do this. Not today. Not in Mama's dress." But my words seemed to fall on deaf ears. He moved toward me with the inexorable advance of a predator closing in on wounded prey, and I knew that the nightmare I had been living was about to become something infinitely worse. What happened next, I won't describe in detail. Not because I'm ashamed, that shame belongs to him alone, but because some violations are too sacred to share, too deeply personal to put into words that others might hear. I will say only this. He took everything from me that night. My innocence, my sense of safety, my ability to trust, and most cruelly of all, my ability to remember my mother's wedding day as anything but the prelude to my own destruction. When it was over, when the dress was torn and stained and my childhood was lying in ruins around me, I lost consciousness. The last thing I remember was the sound of my own screaming echoing through the house and the terrible certainty that no one was coming to save me. I woke up hours later, alone in the dark, with my mother's pearls still around my neck like a collar of shame. I woke up on the floor of my parents' bedroom as the first gray light of dawn crept through the curtains. For a moment, I was disoriented, confused about why I was lying on the hardwood floor wrapped in what remained of my mother's torn wedding dress. Then the memories came flooding back like a dam bursting, and I had to press my hand to my mouth to keep from vomiting. Every part of my body ached with a pain I had never experienced before. The physical agony was terrible, but it was nothing compared to the devastation in my soul. Something fundamental had been broken inside me, something that I instinctively knew could never be repaired. The little girl who had gone to her mother's funeral the day before was gone forever, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. My father was nowhere to be seen, though I could hear the shower running in the master bathroom, the sound of water hitting, tile mixed with his off-key humming, a cheerful tune that seemed obscene in the wake of what he had done. How could he hum? How could he act as though this was just another morning after just another night? With shaking hands, I tried to gather the torn pieces of my mother's wedding dress. The ivory satin was stained and ripped beyond repair, tiny, pearl buttons scattered across the floor like fallen tears. As I held the ruined fabric, I felt like I was holding the destroyed remnants of every sacred thing in my life. The pearl necklace still hung around my neck, its clasp somehow having survived the violence of the night before. I fumbled with trembling fingers to remove it, desperate to get it away from my skin. But the clasp was too delicate for my shaking hands to manage. Each time I tried, the pearls seemed to tighten around my throat like a noose, a permanent reminder of what had been done to me. I finally managed to crawl to my own bedroom, dragging the torn dress with me like a security blanket that provided no security at all. In my closet, I found my school clothes from the previous day and changed into them, desperate to get out of what remained of my mother's gown. But even in my familiar blue skirt and white blouse, I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if everyone who looked at me would somehow know what had happened. The house felt different in the morning light. What had been my home for 12 years now felt like enemy territory, every room contaminated by the memory of the night before. I couldn't look at the living room without seeing myself sitting on that sofa while he planned his assault. I couldn't pass my parents' bedroom without hearing the echoes of my own screams. When my father emerged from the bathroom, showered and dressed for work as if this were any normal Wednesday morning, the sight of him made my stomach lurch. He looked exactly the same, neat, professional, respectable. But I now knew the monster that lived beneath that carefully constructed facade. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said pleasantly, as if he were greeting me across the breakfast table on any ordinary day. You're up early? I couldn't respond. The words stuck in my throat like shards of glass. How could he speak to me as if nothing had changed? How could he pretend that last night had been a dream instead of a nightmare? I've been thinking, he continued, straightening his tie in the hallway mirror, about our conversation regarding your schooling. I've decided that today would be a good day for you to start staying home. You need time to adjust to our new circumstances. The casual way he said it, as if my imprisonment were a natural consequence of my mother's death, filled me with a terror that threatened to overwhelm me. School was the only place where I felt safe, where Mrs. Foster's kind eyes could watch over me, where I could pretend for a few hours that I was still a normal child with a normal life. But I have a math test today, I managed to whisper, my voice so quiet I wasn't sure he could hear me. He turned from the mirror to look at me directly, and I saw something flicker behind his eyes. A warning, a threat, a reminder of his absolute power over me. Your education is my responsibility now, he said firmly. I'll provide everything you need to learn right here at home. You won't be going back to school, Eleanor. Not today, not next week, not ever. The finality of his words hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't just planning to assault me again. He was planning to keep me as his prisoner, cut off from the outside world, completely at his mercy. The isolation he was imposing would make sure that no one could witness what was happening to me. No one could help me. No one could save me. Before leaving for work, he gave me a list of chores that would have been challenging for an adult, let alone a traumatized 12-year-old girl. The floors needed mopping, the laundry needed washing, the bathrooms needed scrubbing. But more than the physical labor, the list was a message. I was no longer his daughter. I was his domestic servant, his property to use as he saw fit. I'll be home for lunch, he said, putting on his coat. I expect everything on that list to be completed by then. And Eleanor? He paused at the front door. If anyone comes by, neighbors, delivery people, anyone, you don't answer the door. As far as the world is concerned, we're still in mourning and need our privacy. Do you understand? I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. The moment the door closed behind him, I collapsed to my knees in the hallway and sobbed until I had no tears left. The sound of my crying echoed through the empty house, a testament to my complete and utter aloneness in the world. But even in my despair, a small spark of defiance began to grow. Mrs. Foster would notice when I didn't show up for school. She would ask questions, maybe even come looking for me. She had always been able to see through the lies my father told about my bruises and injuries. Surely she would see through this one too. Body was too damaged, my spirit too broken to accomplish much. Every movement sent waves of pain through me, constant reminders of the violation I had endured. I found myself stopping frequently, staring out windows at the normal world beyond our house, wondering if I would ever be part of it again. Around 10 o'clock, I heard a car pull into our driveway. Through the front window, I saw Mrs. Foster's familiar blue sedan, and my heart leaped with desperate hope. She had come just as I had prayed she would. She had noticed my absence and come to check on me. The doorbell rang, followed by her gentle voice calling through the door. Eleanor, sweetheart, are you in there? We missed you at school this morning. I stood frozen in the hallway, torn between the desperate need to run to her and the paralyzing fear of what my father would do if I disobeyed his explicit instructions. Her voice continued, patient and caring. Eleanor, I know you're grieving, honey. We all understand that. But I brought your homework assignments and I wanted to make sure you were okay. Can you open the door for just a minute? I approached the door slowly, my hand hovering over the deadbolt. This was my chance, perhaps my only chance, to tell someone what had happened, to ask for help, to escape from the prison my home had become. But my father's threats echoed in my mind, and I knew with terrible certainty that if I opened that door, if I told Mrs. Foster the truth, he would make me pay for it in ways I couldn't even imagine. "I know you're in there, sweetheart, Mrs. Foster said, her voice growing more concerned. "Your father called the school this morning to say you wouldn't be returning, but he didn't explain why. Are you sick? Are you hurt?" The questions hung in the air between us, separated only by a thin wooden door that might as well have been a fortress wall. I pressed my forehead against the cool wood, tears streaming down my face, and whispered words she couldn't hear. "Help. Me. Please help me. I can't do this alone." After several more minutes of knocking and calling, Mrs. Foster finally gave up. I watched through the window as she walked slowly back to her car, her shoulders slumped with disappointment and worry. She paused before getting in, looking back at the house with an expression that suggested she knew something was terribly wrong, but couldn't quite put her finger on what. As her car disappeared down Elm Street, I felt the last thread connecting me to my old life snap. I was truly alone now, trapped in this house with a monster who wore my father's face, with no one to protect me and nowhere to run. The rest of the morning passed in a haze of pain and despair. I attempted some of the chores on his list, but mainly I sat on the floor of my bedroom, rocking back and forth, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened to me and what was surely going to continue happening. When noon approached, I heard his car in the driveway again, and a new wave of terror washed over me. He was coming back, just as he had promised, and I knew that lunch would be followed by something far worse than food. As his key turned in the lock, I realized that the girl who had existed before last night was gone forever. In her place was someone harder, more damaged, but perhaps, if I could find the strength, more determined to survive. Because if I had learned anything from the longest night of my life, it was this: no one was coming to save me. I would have to save myself. The weeks that followed my mother's funeral blurred together into one endless nightmare of captivity and abuse. My father had transformed our house on Elm Street into a carefully constructed prison, and I was both its sole inmate and its secret shame. What had happened on that first terrible night was not an isolated incident born of grief and alcohol. It was the beginning of a systematic campaign of horror that would define the next 3 years of my life. Every morning followed the same ritualistic pattern. My father would shower, dress in his crisp business attire, and transform himself back into the respected insurance agent that Millbrook knew and trusted. Before leaving for work, he would give me detailed instructions for the day: chores to complete, meals to prepare, and most importantly, a strict reminder that I was never, under any circumstances, to answer the door or telephone. "Remember, Eleanor," he would say each morning, his voice carrying that deceptively gentle tone that I had learned to fear more than his rage, "we're still in mourning. People understand that we need our privacy during this difficult time. They respect our need to grieve in solitude." It was a masterful manipulation of our community's natural compassion. By positioning our isolation as a normal part of the mourning process, he ensured that neighbors and friends would give us space rather than intrude. What they saw as respectful distance, I experienced as suffocating imprisonment. The house itself became my world, all 4 walls of it. I learned every creaking floorboard, every crack in the plaster, every way the afternoon light fell across the kitchen table. I memorized the patterns of our neighbors' daily routines through stolen glances out windows, watching children walk to school while I remained trapped inside, watching mothers hang laundry on clotheslines while I scrubbed, floors that would never be clean enough for his satisfaction. Mrs. Foster continued her attempts to check on me during those first few weeks. I would hear her car in the driveway, listen to her worried voice calling through the door, watch her peer through windows trying to catch a glimpse of movement inside. Sometimes she would leave care packages on our front porch, homemade cookies, soup in mason jars, get-well cards from my former classmates. I wanted desperately to run to her, to throw open that door and collapse into her arms while telling her everything. But my father's threats had taken root in my mind like poison ivy, growing stronger and more strangling with each passing day. He had made it clear that any attempt to contact the outside world would result in consequences far worse than what I was already enduring. "If you ever tell anyone about our special relationship," he had whispered one morning after a particularly brutal night, "I'll make sure you disappear. People will think you ran away because you couldn't handle your mother's death. They'll search for a while, but eventually they'll stop looking, and you'll be somewhere where no one will ever find you." The casual way he spoke about murdering me, as if it were just another household chore to be completed, convinced me that he was entirely capable of following through on his threat. So I remained silent behind our locked doors, a ghost haunting my own life. To maintain the illusion of normalcy, my father would occasionally venture out to run errands or attend church services, always returning with stories about the kind people who had asked about me. "Everyone understands that you're still too fragile to be around people," he would report with false sympathy. "They all think you're such a sensitive girl, taking your mother's death so hard." The irony was suffocating. While the community praised my father for his patience with his grieving daughter, he was systematically destroying what remained of my childhood behind closed doors. The very sensitivity they attributed to grief was actually the result of trauma so profound that I had begun to dissociate from my own body during his attacks. School officials made several attempts to check on my welfare during those early weeks. I would hear the phone ringing during the day, but I was forbidden to answer it. When my father returned from work, he would casually mention that the school had called again, expressing concern about my extended absence. "I explained to them that you're receiving private tutoring at home," he would say while loosening his tie. They seemed satisfied with that explanation. "After all, your grades were always exceptional, and they trust that you're continuing your education." But there was no tutoring, no education, no books or lessons beyond the brutal curriculum of survival he was teaching me each night. My mind, once sharp and eager for knowledge, began to dull from lack of stimulation and the constant stress of living in fear. I found myself forgetting things, simple words, basic math, even some of my memories from before my mother's death became hazy and uncertain. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of my captivity. Humans are social creatures, and prolonged solitude can break the spirit as effectively as any physical torture. I began talking to myself, having conversations with imaginary friends, even speaking to my mother's ghost when the loneliness became unbearable. "Mama," I would whisper to her photograph on the mantelpiece, "why didn't you protect me? Why didn't you see what he was really like? Why did you leave me alone with him?" But photographs don't answer, and the dead can't protect the living from monsters who wear familiar faces. As autumn turned to winter, my father's behavior became increasingly erratic and possessive. He began coming home for lunch every day, ostensibly, to check on my progress with household chores, but really to ensure that I hadn't attempted to escape or contact anyone. These midday visits often included new forms of humiliation and abuse, as if the darkness of night wasn't sufficient to contain his depravity. He also started bringing home gifts, items that he claimed were meant to help me feel better about my situation. A new dress that looked disturbingly similar to something my mother might have worn, jewelry that he would insist I wear during his assaults, books about being a good daughter that read more like instruction manuals for submission than anything resembling genuine literature. "I'm trying to help you understand your role in our family," he would explain while forcing me to wear these costumes of his twisted fantasies. "Your mother knew her place, knew her duties. You need to learn the same lessons." The constant comparison to my mother was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of his abuse. He had created a narrative in his diseased mind where I was somehow responsible for filling the void her death had left in his life, not just as a daughter, but as a replacement wife in every sense of the word. During this period, I began to experience what I now understand were symptoms of severe trauma. I would lose hours at a time, finding myself in different rooms of the house with no memory of how I had gotten there. I developed obsessive behaviors, counting ceiling tiles, arranging objects in perfect lines, checking locks over and over again even though I had no key to open them. My body began to show the effects of prolonged stress and abuse. I lost weight rapidly, my clothes hanging loose on my shrinking frame. My hair started falling out in clumps, leaving thin patches on my scalp that I tried desperately to hide. Dark circles appeared under my eyes, and my skin took on a grayish pallor that spoke of someone slowly dying from the inside out. The worst part was the way my mind began to adapt to the horror. What had initially shocked and traumatized me gradually became routine, expected, almost normal. I learned to retreat so far into my own head during his attacks that I could almost convince myself they were happening to someone else entirely. This psychological dissociation was both a survival mechanism and a source of profound guilt. Some twisted part of me began to wonder if my lack of resistance meant that I was somehow complicit in my own abuse. Had I become the willing participant he claimed I was? Was this what I deserved? These thoughts were the poison he was feeding my mind as surely as if he were putting arsenic in my food. By isolating me from any external perspective, any voice of reason or compassion, he was able to reshape my understanding of reality itself. In his version of the world, what was happening to me was normal, natural, even necessary. But deep in the core of my being, a small voice continued to whisper the truth. This was wrong. This was not normal. This was not what daughters were supposed to endure. That voice was growing quieter with each passing day, but it had not yet been completely silenced. It was that tiny spark of rebellion, that stubborn refusal to completely surrender my sense of self, that would eventually save my life. Because while my father believed he had successfully broken me, while he thought he had created the perfect victim who would never fight back or seek help, he had underestimated the power of human resilience. Even in the depths of my despair, even as I felt my childhood slipping away like sand through my fingers, I was learning valuable lessons about survival, about endurance, about the difference between being broken and being bent. I was discovering reserves of strength I never knew I possessed, and developing skills that would serve me well when the opportunity for escape finally presented itself. That opportunity was still months away, but with each day of captivity, with each new horror I survived, I was unconsciously preparing myself for the moment when I would finally say enough and fight back against the monster who had stolen my life. The girl who had fainted on her mother's funeral day was gone forever, but the woman she was becoming, scarred but not defeated, damaged but not destroyed, was slowly taking her place. By the spring of 1964, I had been my father's prisoner for over a year. What had once been unthinkable had become my daily reality, and I had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of his moods with the skill of someone whose life depended on reading the subtle signs of approaching storms. But even the most practiced survivors can be caught off guard when the tempest finally breaks with unprecedented fury. The change began with my body's natural development. At 13, I was no longer the child he had first violated in my mother's wedding dress. My figure was beginning to develop, my face was losing its childish roundness, and most significantly, my monthly cycles had begun. These changes seemed to both fascinate and enrage him, as if my growing maturity was somehow a personal betrayal of his twisted fantasies. "You're becoming too much like her," he said one evening, studying me with those cold, calculating eyes that had haunted my nightmares for months. "Too independent, too womanly." The way he spat the word womanly made it sound like a disease, something shameful and disgusting that needed to be corrected. I had learned by then that his references to her meant my mother, and that any perceived similarity between us was grounds for additional punishment. It was during this time that Mrs. Foster made her most determined attempt yet to breach the walls of our isolation. Rather than simply showing up at our door unannounced, she enlisted the help of Reverend Hayes and Dr. Morrison, Millbrook's only physician. Together, they represented the trinity of community authority: education, faith, and medicine, and they were not going to be dismissed as easily as a single concerned teacher. I was in the kitchen preparing lunch when I heard multiple cars pulling into our driveway. Through the window, I could see Mrs. Foster, Reverend Hayes, and Dr. Morrison walking purposefully toward our front door. My heart began racing with a mixture of hope and terror. This was it, my chance for rescue, but also, potentially, my death sentence if my father discovered that I had somehow orchestrated their visit. The doorbell rang with unusual persistence, followed by Reverend Hayes's authoritative voice. Robert Thompson, we need to speak with you about Eleanor. We're not leaving until we've seen that she's safe and well." I stood frozen in the kitchen, torn between the desperate urge to run to the door and the paralyzing fear of what would happen if I disobeyed my father's most fundamental rule. The voices outside grew more insistent, and I could hear Dr. Morrison discussing legal obligations and welfare checks. But they had come during my father's work hours, and he wasn't there to smooth things over with his practiced charm and reasonable explanations. For the first time since my imprisonment began, I was alone with people who cared about my welfare standing just outside our door. Mrs. Foster's voice cut through my paralysis like a knife. "Eleanor, sweetheart, I know you're in there. We're here to help you. Whatever is happening, whatever you're afraid of, we can fix it. You just need to open this door." My hand moved toward the deadbolt as if it had a mind of its own. This was my moment, my chance to end the nightmare that had consumed more than a year of my life. But as my fingers touched the cold metal, I heard the familiar rumble of my father's car engine in the driveway. He was coming home early. He was going to find these three pillars of our community standing on his doorstep, demanding to see his daughter, and he would know immediately that something had gone wrong with his carefully constructed facade. I heard his car door slam, followed by his voice carrying across the yard with its usual false warmth. "Reverend Hayes, Dr. Morrison, Mrs. Foster, what a pleasant surprise. To what do I owe this honor?" Through the window, I watched him approach the group with the confident stride of someone who believed he could talk his way out of any situation. He was still wearing his work clothes, still playing the role of the respected businessman, but there was something different in his posture, a tension that suggested he knew his performance of a lifetime was about to begin. "Robert," Reverend Hayes said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "we're here about Eleanor. It's been over a year since anyone in this community has laid eyes on that child. We need to see her today, to confirm that she's healthy and safe." I pressed myself against the kitchen wall, listening to every word of the conversation happening just feet away from me. My father's response was masterful in its calculated vulnerability. "Gentlemen, Mrs. Foster, I appreciate your concern. Truly I do. But Eleanor has been struggling significantly since Catherine's death. She's become extremely withdrawn, almost agoraphobic. She refuses to leave the house, barely speaks to me, and becomes hysterical at the thought of seeing other people." His voice cracked slightly on the word hysterical, a perfect touch of paternal anguish that I knew was completely fabricated. He was painting me as mentally ill, emotionally unstable, a child so damaged by grief that isolation was the kindest option. Dr. Morrison's voice carried the professional skepticism of someone who had seen too much to be easily fooled. "Robert, if Eleanor is experiencing such severe psychological distress, she needs professional help. I should examine her, and we should discuss options for treatment." "I've been considering that," my father replied smoothly. "There's an excellent residential facility in Columbus that specializes in children who have experienced severe trauma. I've been in correspondence with them about possibly enrolling Eleanor for intensive treatment." The casual way he mentioned sending me away to some institution made my blood run cold. Was this his backup plan? If the community became too interested in my welfare, Would he simply have me committed to a mental hospital where my credibility would be forever destroyed? Mrs. Foster's voice cut through the diplomatic dance of the men. Robert Thompson, I don't care what kind of trauma that child has experienced. I need to see her with my own eyes right now, or I'm calling the sheriff's office. There was steel in her voice that I had never heard before, the sound of someone who had reached the limit of her patience with excuses and deflections. In that moment, I realized that Mrs. Foster had never believed my father's explanations, had never stopped suspecting that something terrible was happening behind our closed doors. Of course, my father said, his voice maintaining its reasonable tone despite what I knew must be mounting panic. Eleanor is upstairs resting, but I'll get her. Just, please be patient with her. She's not the same child you remember. I heard his footsteps on the front porch, then the sound of his key turning in the lock. In seconds, he would be inside the house, and I would face the consequences of having witnesses to our situation. I didn't know whether to run upstairs and pretend to be sleeping, or stand my ground in the kitchen and hope that Mrs. Foster's presence would somehow protect me. The front door opened, and I heard him call out in a voice loud enough for our visitors to hear. Eleanor? Sweetheart? Some friends are here to see you. Mrs. Foster, Reverend Hayes, and Dr. Morrison. They want to make sure you're feeling all right. His footsteps approached the kitchen, and when he appeared in the doorway, I saw something in his face that terrified me more than any rage I had ever witnessed. It was the look of a cornered animal, a predator whose hunting ground had been invaded by larger, more dangerous threats. There you are, he said, his voice carrying a warning that only I could interpret. Our friends are here to visit. Aren't you happy to see them? I nodded silently, not trusting my voice to remain steady. He approached me with that same false gentleness he had perfected over the months of my captivity, placing his hand on my shoulder in what would appear to be a loving gesture to anyone watching from the doorway. But his fingers dug into my flesh, with bruising pressure, and his voice dropped to a whisper that only I could hear. If you say one single word that makes them suspicious, I will kill you before they can get you out of this house. Do you understand me? I nodded again, feeling the last vestiges of hope drain from my body like water from a broken vessel. Even with rescue standing on our front porch, even with people who cared about me demanding to see me, I was still trapped by his threats and my own terror. Good girl, he whispered, then raised his voice to its normal volume. Come on, let's go say hello. They're very worried about you. As he guided me toward the front door, his hand never leaving my shoulder, I realized that this moment would determine the course of the rest of my life. I could continue to play the role of the traumatized, silent child and condemn myself to whatever fate he had planned for me. Or I could find the courage to speak the words that might save my life, even if they meant risking everything. The front door loomed ahead of us like a portal between two worlds, the world of his lies and the world of possible freedom. In a few seconds, I would be face to face with the people who represented my last, best hope for salvation. The question was, did I have the strength to take it? As my father guided me toward the front door, his fingers maintaining their painful grip on my shoulder, I felt as though I were walking through thick water. Every step seemed to take forever, yet we were approaching the threshold between my prison and possible freedom far too quickly. My heart hammered against my ribs so violently that I was certain everyone would be able to hear it. Through the open doorway, I could see Mrs. Foster, Reverend Hayes, and Dr. Morrison standing on our front porch. The afternoon sunlight behind them created silhouettes that looked almost angelic to my starved eyes. Mrs. Foster stood slightly forward from the two men, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, and even from a distance I could see the worry etched deeply into her familiar features. There she is, my father announced, his voice carrying that perfect note of paternal affection that he had spent over a year perfecting. Eleanor, sweetheart, look who's come to visit. As we stepped onto the porch, I felt the warm spring air touch my face for the first time in months. The sensation was so foreign, so overwhelming after my extended captivity, that I had to blink back tears. The world outside our house seemed impossibly bright, impossibly alive, impossibly normal. Mrs. Foster's sharp intake of breath was audible to everyone present. Her eyes swept over me, taking in details that I had stopped noticing in my day-to-day survival, my dramatic weight loss, the hollow circles under my eyes, the way I held myself as if expecting a blow at any moment. But it was more than my physical appearance that shocked her. It was the way I stood pressed against my father's side, not seeking comfort, but trapped there by his iron grip. "Eleanor," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Oh, sweetheart, look at you." Reverend Hayes cleared his throat, his expression growing more grave as he studied my appearance. "Robert, this child looks quite unwell. When was the last time she saw a physician?" Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his medical training making him the most qualified to assess my condition. "With your permission, Robert, I'd like to examine Eleanor. Even if she's been struggling emotionally, we need to ensure she's physically healthy." My father's fingers tightened on my shoulder, his warning pressure increasing to the point where I had to bite my lip to keep from crying out. "Of course, doctor, though as I mentioned, Eleanor becomes very anxious around people. She hasn't spoken to anyone outside our household since Catherine's funeral." It was a masterful lie, designed to explain any strange behavior I might exhibit while simultaneously discrediting anything I might say. If I did find the courage to speak, he had already laid the groundwork to dismiss my words as the ravings of a traumatized, possibly mentally ill child. Mrs. Foster knelt, down so that she was at my eye level, her movements slow and gentle as if she were approaching a frightened animal. "Eleanor, honey, it's me, Mrs. Foster. Do you remember me? I've missed you so much at school." I wanted to respond, to throw myself into her arms and sob out every detail of the nightmare my life had become. But my father's presence loomed over me like a storm cloud, and his whispered threat echoed in my mind. "I will kill you before they can get you out of this house." Instead, I managed only a small nod, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I tried to speak. Mrs. Foster's eyes searched mine, and I saw the exact moment when she realized that my silence wasn't just grief or trauma. It was fear. Raw, paralyzing. Terror of the man standing behind me. "Eleanor," Dr. Morrison said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to treating frightened children. "I'd like to listen to your heart and check your breathing. Would that be all right?" Before I could respond, my father stepped forward. "Perhaps it would be better if we went inside for the examination. Eleanor is more comfortable in familiar surroundings." The suggestion was reasonable, but Mrs. Foster's sharp no cut through the air like a knife. "I think the porch is fine. Fresh air will do Eleanor good." The tension between the adults was palpable now. Mrs. Foster had moved beyond polite concern into active suspicion, and both Reverend Hayes and Dr. Morrison were beginning to sense that something was seriously wrong with the picture my father was trying to paint. Dr. Morrison opened his medical bag and withdrew his stethoscope. As he approached me, I caught Mrs. Foster's eye, and in that moment, I saw something that gave me a flicker of hope. She knew. Somehow, despite my father's careful explanations and my own terrified silence, she knew that I was in danger. The doctor's examination was thorough but gentle. He checked my pulse, listened to my breathing, and looked into my eyes with a small penlight. But it was when he asked me to extend my arms that everything changed. "Eleanor, can you push up your sleeves for me? I want to check your circulation." The simple request hit me like a physical blow. My sleeves. The long sleeves that I wore even in the warmest weather, that had become as much a part of my uniform as the silence my father demanded. Beneath those sleeves were bruises, old and new, finger marks and grip injuries that told the story of my captivity more clearly than any words ever could. My father sensed the danger immediately. "Doctor, perhaps that's enough for today. Eleanor is becoming agitated, and you know how important it is not to overstimulate children in her condition." But Dr. Morrison had also sensed something amiss. His years of medical practice had taught him to recognize the signs of abuse, and my reaction to his simple request had set off every alarm bell in his professional consciousness. "Eleanor," he said quietly, his voice firmer than before, "I need you to roll up your sleeves, just for a moment." I looked up at my father, seeking permission I knew would never come. His face was a mask of parental concern, but his eyes promised consequences beyond my worst nightmares if I complied with the doctor's request. It was Mrs. Foster who broke the deadlock. Rising to her feet, she positioned herself between my father and me, her body language shifting from concerned teacher to protective mother bear. "Eleanor," she said, her voice carrying an authority I had never heard from her before. "Whatever you're afraid of, we can protect you from it. But you have to help us. You have to show us what's been happening." The words hung in the air between us like a bridge spanning an enormous chasm. On one side lay the familiar hell of my captivity, the known quantity of my father's abuse, the certainty of continued suffering, but also continued survival. On the other side lay the unknown, the possibility of freedom, but also the terrifying prospect of his threatened retaliation. Reverend Hayes stepped forward, adding his moral authority to the moment. "Child, if someone has been hurting you, it's not your fault. Whatever you've been told, whatever threats have been made, we are here to protect you. God doesn't want his children to suffer in silence." My father's hand moved from my shoulder to the back of my neck, his fingers finding the pressure point that he had used so many times to control me. But this time, instead of causing pain, his touch triggered something unexpected: anger. For the first time in over a year, I felt a surge of pure, clean rage cut through the fog of fear and submission that had defined my existence. How dare he touch me like that in front of these good people? How dare he continue to pretend to be a loving father while his fingers found the exact spot that would cause me pain? The anger gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. My hands moved to my sleeves, and despite my father's sharp intake of breath behind me, despite the knowledge that I was crossing a line from which there could be no return, I began to roll up my right sleeve. The bruises were revealed inch by inch, purple finger marks around my wrist, yellowing grip injuries on my forearm, and most damning of all, the perfect imprint of adult fingers that had grabbed and twisted my arm just 2 days earlier. Mrs. Foster's gasp was audible to everyone on the porch. Dr. Morrison's professional composure cracked, and I saw him exchange a meaningful look with Reverend Hayes. But it was my father's reaction that told the complete story. The mask of concerned parenthood slipped entirely, replaced by an expression of such cold fury that even the 3 adults stepped back involuntarily. In that moment, they saw what I had been living with for over a year, the monster that wore a respected businessman's face. "Those are from accidents," he said quickly, but his voice had lost its smooth confidence. "Eleanor is very clumsy since her mother's death. She falls frequently, bumps into things. Dr. Morrison, surely you can see that grief affects children in many ways. But the evidence was too clear, too systematic to be explained away by clumsiness. These were restraint injuries, control injuries, the unmistakable signatures of deliberate abuse." Dr. Morrison closed his medical bag with deliberate finality. "Robert Thompson, I'm required by law to report suspected child abuse to the authorities. These injuries are not consistent with accidental trauma. Furthermore," Reverend Hayes added, his voice carrying the weight of moral condemnation, "I'll be contacting the sheriff immediately. Eleanor, you're coming with us. Right now." My father's hand tightened on my neck, and for a moment I thought he might actually try to drag me back into the house, might attempt to barricade us both inside and make good on his threats to kill me rather than lose control. But Mrs. Foster had anticipated this possibility. "Sheriff Wilson is waiting in his patrol car at the end of the street," she said calmly. "If you try to prevent us from taking Eleanor, he'll be here in 30 seconds. The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. My father's mind was racing, calculating odds, considering options, weighing the cost of fighting against the cost of surrender. Finally, his hand fell away from my neck. "Take her then," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "But you'll see. She's not right in the head since her mother died. Whatever she tells you, remember that she's sick, confused, traumatized. No one will believe the fantasies of a disturbed child." Even in defeat, he was still trying to control the narrative, still attempting to discredit me before I could speak. But it was too late. The evidence was visible on my arms, and soon it would be documented, photographed, and presented to people who had the power to protect me. Mrs. Foster took my hand gently, her touch so different from my father's that I almost wept at the simple kindness of it. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's get you somewhere safe." As we walked down the front steps of the house that had been my prison for over a year, I didn't look back. I was afraid that if I saw my father's face one more time, I might lose my courage and run back to the familiar hell rather than face the unknown future that lay ahead. But I had done it. I had found the strength to show them the truth, to take the first step toward freedom. Whatever came next, I was no longer facing it alone. Walking away from that house on Elm Street was like emerging from a cave after being buried alive for over a year. Every step felt surreal, every breath of fresh air almost painful after so long in captivity. Mrs. Foster kept her hand gently on my back as we made our way to Sheriff Wilson's patrol car, and I found myself walking closer to her than I had to any adult since my mother's death. Sheriff Wilson was a kind man in his 50s who had known my family for years. When he saw me approaching his car, his weathered face creased with concern and something that looked like guilt, perhaps for not investigating sooner, for trusting in the facade my father had so carefully constructed. "Hello there, Eleanor," he said softly, removing his hat as we approached. "Mrs. Foster and Dr. Morrison have told me some things that are mighty troubling. We're going to take you somewhere safe while we sort all this out, all right?" I managed a small nod, still not trusting my voice after so many months of enforced silence. The back seat of the patrol car felt like the safest place I had been in over a year, even though I knew that my father could see us from the house windows. As we drove away, I finally allowed myself one look back at the white colonial that had been my prison. My father stood silhouetted in the front doorway, watching us leave with an expression I couldn't read from that distance. But I didn't need to see his face to know what he was thinking. Even from inside the sheriff's car, surrounded by people who wanted to protect me, I could feel the weight of his rage and the promise of his threats. The next several hours passed in a blur of medical examinations, gentle questions, and forms that adults filled out while speaking in hushed tones. Dr. Morrison documented every bruise, every mark, every sign of the systematic abuse I had endured. The nurses at Millbrook General Hospital were kind but professional, treating me with the careful gentleness reserved for broken things that might shatter at any moment. Mrs. Foster never left my side during those first crucial hours. When the social workers arrived to ask their difficult questions, she held my hand. When the photographers came to document the evidence of my abuse, she shielded me from their clinical stares. When I finally found my voice and began to tell my story, she was there to offer tissues and encouragement when the words became too painful to speak. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Once I began talking, once I found the courage to speak the unspeakable truths I had carried in silence for so long, other pieces of evidence began falling into place. Neighbors came forward with observations they had dismissed at the time, the fact that they never saw me anymore, the strange sounds that sometimes came from our house at night, my father's odd behavior in the months following my mother's death. The trial, when it finally came, was both vindication and torture. Sitting in that courtroom, facing my father across a space that felt both infinite and far too small, I had to relive every detail of my captivity for a room full of strangers. But I also got to see something I had never seen before. My father powerless, sitting in handcuffs, no longer able to control the narrative or manipulate the truth. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The judge, a stern woman named Patricia Collins, made it clear that she considered his crimes among the most heinous she had ever encountered. "To abuse a child is unconscionable," she said during sentencing. "To do so while hiding behind the facade of grief and respectability, to use a mother's funeral as the beginning of such systematic cruelty, represents a level of depravity that demands the full weight of justice." I was placed in the temporary custody of Mrs. Foster and her husband Daniel, while the courts worked out permanent arrangements. That first night in their modest home, sleeping in a real bed with unlocked doors and windows that opened to let in fresh air, I wept harder than I had since my mother's death. But these were different tears, not the desperate, silent sobs of captivity, but the cleansing tears of someone finally safe enough to grieve properly. The healing process was neither quick nor easy. Trauma, I learned, doesn't simply disappear once you're removed from the source of danger. For months, I jumped at sudden noises, flinched when adults moved too quickly, and woke up screaming from nightmares that transported me back to that house on Elm Street. But Mrs. Foster, Rebecca, as she eventually asked me to call her, had endless patience with my broken pieces. She found a therapist in Columbus who specialized in childhood trauma, Dr. Sarah Williams, who taught me that what had happened to me had a name, that my reactions were normal, and most importantly, that healing was possible. School was initially overwhelming. After more than a year of isolation, being around dozens of children my own age felt chaotic and frightening. But gradually, with Rebecca's support and Dr. Williams's guidance, I began to reclaim pieces of the childhood that had been stolen from me. The Fosters formally adopted me when I was 15. The legal ceremony was simple, but the emotional weight of having a family again, of belonging somewhere safe, was profound. Rebecca and Daniel never tried to replace my mother, but they gave me something equally precious, proof that adults could be trusted, that families could be havens rather than prisons. I excelled academically, throwing myself into books and learning with the hunger of someone making up for lost time. I graduated valedictorian of my high school class and earned a full scholarship to Ohio State University, where I studied social work with a specialization in child welfare. My career was built on the foundation of my own survival. I became the adult I had needed during those dark months, someone who believed children when they spoke difficult truths, someone who recognized the signs of abuse that others might miss, someone who fought fiercely to protect the vulnerable. I married Michael Patterson when I was 26. He was a kind man, a teacher like Rebecca, who understood that some scars never fully fade, but that they don't have to define you. We had 3 children together, Sarah, Thomas, and Jennifer, and I was determined to give them the childhood I had lost, filled with laughter and safety and unconditional love. Rebecca lived to see all of my children born and to watch them take their first steps in her living room. She passed away peacefully in 2001 at the age of 81, surrounded by the family she had chosen and the children she had helped save. At her funeral, I spoke about how she had given me back my life, how her courage to ask difficult questions had literally saved me from destruction. My father died in prison in 1987. I felt no grief at his passing, only a quiet sense of closure. The monster who had stolen my childhood could no longer hurt anyone, and the little girl who had once been his victim had grown into a strong woman who used her voice to protect others. Today, at 73, I run a crisis center for abused children here in Millbrook. The white colonial on Elm Street was torn down years ago, and in its place stands a small park with a playground where children laugh and play safely. Sometimes I sit on the bench there and watch them, marveling at their innocence and promising my mother's memory that I will do everything in my power to protect it. If you're listening to this story and you recognize yourself in that frightened child I once was, please know this: you are not alone, it is not your fault, and there is hope beyond your current circumstances. There are Mrs. Fosters in this world, people who will believe you and fight for you if you can find the courage to speak your truth. The little girl who fainted on her mother's funeral day grew up to become a woman who helps other children find their voices. That transformation wasn't easy, and the scars remain, but they serve as reminders of how far we can travel from darkness toward light. Your story doesn't have to end in that dark place. There is healing. There is hope. There is a future where the pain you're experiencing now becomes the strength that helps you save others. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, that future includes homemade apple butter, children's laughter in the place where monsters once lived, and the knowledge that speaking the truth, no matter how frightening, really can set you free. Thank you for listening to my story. May it give you courage for whatever battles you're fighting, and hope for the healing that awaits on the other side. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.